Meet Cheesy, Hammy, Chicky and Eggy, 4 fun-loving sandwiches. Cheesy is the cheese and tomato sandwich. He's a natural leader of sandwiches, and he's a little old-fashioned and careful. Hammy's the ham sandwich. She's sensible and always tries to have fun without getting into mischief. Chicky is the chicken salad sandwich. He's adventurous and often does things without thinking. And Eggy's the egg and cress sandwich. Usually quite timid, Eggy is sometimes naughty, although he doesn't really mean it. The sandwiches live in the fridge with their friends, and they come out to have adventures when no one is around in the house. No one, that is, except you. One afternoon, the sandwiches were as usual wondering what to do, and as usual, it was Cheesy and Hammy who were making all the suggestions. Cheesy led off the discussion. "Why don't we go and visit Magic Ian, the magician?" he said. "He might have some new tricks to show us. Tricks that work, perhaps." "Not after last time, Cheesy," said Hammy. "I haven't got over the thought of being sawn in half, and Chicky still hasn't quite recovered from disappearing into Ian's hat. Can't we go somewhere entirely new? What about a pantomime?" "Good idea," replied Cheesy, "but they only have pantomimes at Christmas, I think. Still, we could go to a show at one of the theatres in town. We've never done that before." "That's a great idea," said Hammy. The others agreed. So, without further ado, they climbed out of the fridge and left the house. It looked like rain, and they didn't want to get wet, because as everyone knows, there's nothing worse than a soggy sandwich. So they waited for a bus which soon arrived. They climbed on board and sat down. The doors closed, and they started their journey into town. The bus took them into the centre of town, where they got off. They didn't know where any theatres were, and so they started to walk about in the hope of coming across one. After a bit, they came to a door which seemed as if it might be a theatre entrance. Of course, sandwiches can't read, and they weren't entirely sure what the building might be. They opened the door, went inside, and climbed some stairs. At the top of the stairs was another door. They went through and came to a partition with a glass window. They took this to be the ticket office. Chicky knocked on the glass, and straight away it slid open, and a lady appeared at the other side. "What can I do for you?" she said. Chicky replied, "What show have you got for us today, please?" "What do you mean?" the lady replied. Chicky simply repeated the question, thinking that the lady hadn't heard him. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any shows here," the lady told him. "What sort of a theatre do you call this?" asked Chicky, who was upset and a little angry. "This is not a theatre, actually," said the lady sharply. "It's a fire station." At that very moment, and before the sandwiches had time to say anything to each other about the dreadful misunderstanding, or to apologize to the lady, a shrill bell rang out, so loudly that the sandwiches jumped in fright. Almost immediately, a lot of firemen started rushing past them. The sandwiches seemed to get caught up in the rush as the firemen ran at breakneck speed along a corridor. At the end of the corridor, the firemen disappeared through a hole in the floor. The sandwiches arrived at the hole in the floor, first Chicky, then Cheesy, then Hammy, and last of all Eggy. None of them could stop in time, and one by one they fell through the hole. There was a pole reaching to the ground below, and the sandwiches slithered down it to land in a heap at the bottom. To make matters worse still, a big fireman landed right on top of them. Slowly they picked themselves up. There were bits of tomato, cress, and lettuce everywhere. The sandwiches spent the next 15 minutes rearranging themselves. By that time, all the firemen had gone, and the fire station was deserted. Cheesy said, "Do we still feel like going to the theatre?" The others all wanted to. They found their way out of the fire station and carried on along the street until they found another door which looked as if it might be a theatre. This time there was a man at a counter just inside the door. "Have you come for the show?" he asked. "Just go on through." The sandwiches were instantly excited. They had found a theatre. They walked along a passageway, at the end of which was a large hall with walls on 3 sides and enormous curtains on the 4th side. "The stage must be on the other side of those curtains," reasoned Hammy. "But it's a little strange that there are no seats here in the auditorium." Just at that moment, the huge curtains parted. Then the strangest thing happened. Instead of the lights going down in the part of the theatre where the sandwiches were, they got even brighter, with spotlights shining on each of the sandwiches. Not only that, but the lights went off completely on the other side of the curtains where the stage was supposed to be. A man appeared from the wings and walked out to the centre where a microphone was positioned on a stand. He faced away from the sandwiches. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am your compere for this afternoon, and I welcome you all to the World Talent Competition. As you can see, we have 4 splendid contestants, and I'm sure you all wish them the best of luck." The compere was pointing at the sandwiches. There came a tremendous round of applause, and in the darkness the sandwiches could just make out hundreds of clapping hands. It was then that the truth dawned on them. They were on the stage, not in the auditorium, and they were to be the performers, not the audience. "We will let the contestants introduce their own acts," said the compere. The sandwiches were panicking. What acts could they perform? They'd never had to do anything like this before, and they were scared as well. Chicky was the first to compose himself. "I am the strongest sandwich in the world," he said, "so I should do some sort of strongman, or rather strong sandwich, act." He walked across to the microphone and announced that he was going to perform an act of great strength. There was a drum roll. Chicky looked around for some props to use in his act. Apart from the microphone, the only objects on the stage were a piano and a piano stool. That would do, he thought. He went to the stool, and with one hand he slowly lifted one of its legs until the whole stool was fully 10 centimetres off the ground. The people in the front row, who were the only ones near enough to see that Chicky had raised the stool right off the ground, applauded. Gradually, people in the rows further back realised it as well, and they too applauded. The volume of the applause was so great that Chicky was overcome with emotion and let his grip of the stool slacken. It fell on top of him. The other sandwiches rushed over to him, picked him up, and carried him to one side of the stage where he could lie down and recover. Then it was Cheesy's turn. "I am a thinking sandwich," he thought, "and it would be appropriate for me to do something clever." But what? He suddenly remembered a juggling act he'd seen at the circus. He rushed off the stage and came back with some ping-pong balls. At first he juggled with 1 ball till he felt that he'd got the hang of juggling, then with 2, but it was only when he started juggling with 3 balls that the audience broke into a round of applause. Cheesy then got carried away and threw all the balls into the air, but was unable to juggle or even catch any of them. They all landed on his head and knocked him over. At first, Cheesy was very embarrassed at having dropped all the balls, but the audience, thinking that this was a comedy act, laughed and clapped as loud as they could. Cheesy left the stage, half bowing and half stumbling. Hammy then turned to Eggy. "What are we going to do?" she asked him. "I'm going home," Eggy replied. "I just don't want to go on the stage at all." "Well, you simply must, Eggy," said Hammy, and she grabbed him and pulled him onto the stage. "We'll just do a dance. It may not be terribly good, but at least we'll have shown that we're not afraid." "But we are afraid," said Eggy. Try as he might, though, he couldn't break free from Hammy's hold. Hammy tried to dance elegantly, but with Eggy hanging on to her, it was impossible. For Eggy's part, he was backpedaling as hard as he could so as to get off the stage at the earliest opportunity. The audience didn't know what Eggy was trying to do. They thought that this was the finest tap dancing act that they'd ever seen, and they clapped even louder than they had for the two previous acts. Eventually Hammy got tired, and her grip of Eggy eased. Eggy's backpedaling took over, and they both fell back off the stage. The compere came out onto the stage and announced to the audience that the talent competition had been a very close affair, but that the winner, with his fine display of tap dancing, was Eggy. Eggy had to come out again and receive an enormous trophy which was so heavy that it needed all the sandwiches to carry it. The sandwiches went home exhausted. The following morning, lying on the doormat, was the daily newspaper, whose headline read, "Egg Gets Cup." Eggy was very generous, though. He had not really deserved the trophy. "Although the cup was awarded to me," he said, "I want to share it with all of you." And that's just what he did.